Thank you very much, Joseph. How's the volume? Can everyone hear in the back? Just fine. And thank you, Dr. Schwartz, for, I think he left the room, but for his support for this wonderful institution. It's a real honor for me to be here in Prague. It's my first time in Prague, and I like what I see so far. And it looks like most of the audience is comprised of students, so I'm going to try to address myself primarily to the students, to my audience. And my own title, I'm not sure exactly what title Joseph gave me on the brochure, but what I'm going to talk about is Austrian political economy and industrial organization. And it's based on some research that I've done over the years, and I thought I'd explain about this to some extent. Austrian political economy, well, what is that? Well, there's a large literature in it. But what I'd like to focus on is the Austrian idea of competition and how it differs from what you might call the mainstream or neoclassical theory of competition, and how that has influenced my own thinking about issues that I've researched, such as American antitrust policy and public policy toward the so-called natural monopolies, and also some of the literature in public choice, in the discipline of public choice. And basically, from the time of Adam Smith on until about the early 20th century, any economist or anyone who wrote on the topic of economics on competition thought of competition the way the Austrians do, as a dynamic system of rivalry and entrepreneurship that involved price cutting, product differentiation, sometimes mergers, corporate mergers, but by the time you get to the 19th century. And that was basically it. Competition was a dynamic, rivalrous process. It was a discovery procedure where markets allow us to discover what consumers want, how to best go about satisfying the needs of consumers, how to organize production. It's the market process that reveals all of this important information to us. But then at the beginning of the 20th century, by about the 1920s and 30s, in the economics profession, decided that it wanted to imitate physics, basically, and become scientific. So the old way of thinking about competition was abandoned by everyone but the Austrian school, and the new theory was adopted, the theory of perfect competition. Frank Knight, the old Chicago school economist, one of the founders, I suppose, of the modern Chicago school, in his book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, published in the 1920s, summarized sort of the state of the art of the theory of competition at that time, and it was the perfect competition model. And so the thinking about competition totally changed from sort of the way in which the ordinary people, non-economists, ordinary people who would just pay attention to commerce and think they know something about it, thought about competition, to this theory that all the students in the room have probably been taught, that competition involves homogeneous products, homogeneous prices, many firms, freedom of entry and exit into industry. Those became the hallmarks. Those are the assumptions behind the so-called perfect competition model. And by the time you get to the 1950s, the late George Stigler, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1983, was writing an article in the Journal of Political Economy saying that competition, perfect competition, requires the Sherman Antitrust Act, at least in America. That was America's first anti-monopoly or antitrust law in America. And why did he say that? He said that, well, because of these assumptions that many firms, for example, are required for competition. And the only way to have many firms is to have a government agency, so said George Stigler, to break up industry if industry becomes comprised of fewer firms. And so the whole thinking about competition evolved from the Adam Smith / Austrian view of competition to this way of thinking. The markets hadn't changed significantly, but the way in which economists think about markets changed. And so hopefully that's sort of a 5-minute overview of the evolution of the theory of competition in the economics profession. And of course, what came along also in the 1930s was the whole monopolistic competition revolution, which I think of as being characterized by what the economist Harold Demsetz calls the nirvana fallacy. The idea of setting up this totally unrealistic and idealistic model of perfect competition and then comparing the real world to that. And the real world, of course, is never perfect. Nothing on earth is perfect. And so if you compare real world markets to nirvana, well, they're always going to fail. And so we have what I call the market failure everywhereian school of economics. That's where markets fail everywhere because, of course, they're not perfect in the mode of those assumptions behind the competitive model. And so you had a really broad attack on capitalism based on this new theory of competition, relatively new theory of competition. I called this Austrian political economy. That's in a nutshell what I have to say about competition. Political economy, there are a number of concepts here that I'm going to mention that are relevant to what I'm going to have to say in a few minutes. And they're not exclusive to the Austrians alone. There are other economists, for sure, who adopted these ideas. And the first one that Austrians like Murray Rothbard have written about quite a bit is actually a very old idea. I believe its origins were in the 18th century French economists. There was a school of thought called the French Industrial School of Economics. And one of the ideas they developed was in democracies how societies are divided into two groups. One is tax consumers and taxpayers. Tax consumers are people who are net beneficiaries of tax dollars spent by government. Taxpayers are the ones who are net payers. They pay more in than they get in terms of any kind of services. And from the time of the French Industrial School to the present day, it's been recognized by modern Austrian economists that the tax consumers will inevitably outnumber the taxpayers and will dominate in a democracy, so that the taxpayers will be constantly plundered by the tax consumers in any kind of democracy. That's one idea. Another idea regarding political economy is the idea that majority rule in a democracy doesn't really have a lot to do with what the majority wants. Friedrich Hayek put it very succinctly in his book, Law, Legislation, and Liberty. He said that because of the phenomenon of log rolling, whereby politicians will trade votes. If I'm a politician from a farm state or a farm region, agricultural region, for example, I may vote for a bill that spends money in the cities, even though I have no cities in my district, because I got the congressman or the legislator from the city to promise to vote for my farm bill when it comes up next month, my agricultural bill, so vote trading. So that when that goes on, what Hayek said was that the end result of democracy is not what the majority wants, but one big collection of special interest legislation. And the way he characterized it was, it's all what one person had to give up in order to get what he or she wants when their project comes up for a vote next time. And so even though it's called majority rule, it often has very little to do with the majority of the population. It's generally one big collection of special interest legislation, and it's designed the phenomenon of government spending being characterized by concentrated benefits to relatively small but politically cohesive groups, and the costs are widely dispersed or spread out among the general population. The fourth principle of political economy that the Austrians especially are known for emphasizing is the role of intellectuals. Murray Rothbard wrote very eloquently on the role of intellectuals in supporting the growth of the state. And he mentioned that even a totalitarian society must ultimately rest, its power must ultimately rest on ideas. Because after all, a totalitarian society is run by really a few thousand people, and they may have a lot of guns and tanks, but they are outnumbered by millions and millions of people who could easily overthrow them at any moment because of the sheer numbers of them. How do you keep these masses of people from overthrowing you if you're a tyrant? Well, you have to brainwash them, essentially. You have to propagandize them. You have to dominate the educational system to get them to acquiesce in your monopoly power in government. And so whether it's a totalitarian society or a democratic society, The role of intellectuals is seen as being very important to Austrians like the late Murray Rothbard. And of course, in the industrial organization, at least as it's been affected or as it's been developed in America, which is my experience, the people who have been sort of the intellectual background, providing the intellectual background for interventionism in America started out with the German nationalists. There were a lot of Americans who went to Germany and were educated by the German historical school. This is the early 20th century, and then returned to America to teach at prestigious universities like Johns Hopkins University. I'm thinking of Richard T. Ely, who was one of the co-founders of the American Economic Association. And they were all interventionists. They disavowed economic theory per se, and they developed a long list of ad hoc rationalizations for government intervention. Then we had the Keynesians and the people who I call the market failure everywhereans, who believe there's market failure everywhere. The post-Keynesians, neo-Keynesians. I've lost track of how many Keynesians with an adjective in front of them exists now, but they all seem to be pretty much the same crowd. They're Keynesians, but ever since Keynesianism became discredited, they seem to think that if they call themselves something else, like a post-Keynesian or an anti-Keynesian, that people won't know that they're still just old-fashioned Keynesians. And then we have the mathematical socialists in the economics profession. An older friend of mine who once met Kenneth Arrow at the Hoover Institution in California, after having talked with him for a while and spent a sabbatical there and got to know Arrow a good bit, came to the conclusion that Arrow, the great mathematical economist, in his views on economic policy was no different than the late John Kenneth Galbraith, who was one of the most well-known socialist economists in America. And he said the main difference is Arrow spoke in mathematics and Galbraith spoke in plain English. But they basically believed in the same things and used much of their careers to advance the same causes, but just in a different language. One, the language of mathematics, mostly, and economics, and the other in just literary work. And so that's how intellectuals, I think, have been very influential in America in shaping industrial policy, antitrust policy, and so forth. And so what I'd like to do with the rest of my time is to talk to you about some of my research and how it's been guided by these ideas that I call Austrian political economy. And one of them was on, one research project was on antitrust. And the Chicago School was famous for years, beginning in the 1950s, in publishing hundreds of journal articles and books criticizing antitrust regulation in America, which most other democracies adopted, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned. Some of the people in the room may remember that as soon as communism fell, the World Bank and the United States government and other governments sent consultants to Eastern and Central Europe to tell them how to adopt antitrust regulation like we have in America. There was a lot of money involved, government money, tax money involved in doing that. And I remember at the time thinking, what a shame that those of us who know that this has all been one big mistake for 100 years in America don't have the funds that the government has to go and tell the Eastern and Central Europeans, wait a minute, think twice before doing this. But that didn't happen. But anyway, one of my areas of interest in research for years had been antitrust regulation. And I had read many of these articles criticizing antitrust regulation. But the one puzzling thing I noticed about the Chicago School critics of antitrust regulation is that they always insisted that we still need to have antitrust regulation. They would argue that it's been anti-competitive for 100 years in America. But still, they said at the beginning, and we're talking the year 1890, it was necessary because there was pervasive market failure in terms of rampant monopolization of the American economy in the 1880s and up to the year 1890. Therefore, government came in and corrected this market failure. And then the second part of the story told by the Chicago School is, but unfortunately, once they started enforcing the antitrust laws, the actual enforcement, more often than not, made the economy less competitive, not more competitive. It tended to cause prices to be higher and not lower, and it stifled entrepreneurship and innovation. And that whole story sounded very fishy to me, very strange. How could it be that this was a good institution at the beginning and had been sort of distorted for a century? Might it not be possible that it was always designed to harm competition? Maybe it's possible that it never was intended, despite all the rhetoric the politicians put out there, to correct market failures. Maybe it was designed to do what legislation always does, benefit special interests at the expense of the general public, not to protect the general public. And this was anathema. This was not the kind of question that would even be asked at the University of Chicago. In fact, one of my papers that I thought, in all immodesty, was a darn good paper, that was a critique of something George Stigler had written. I sent it to the Journal of Law and Economics, which is published at the University of Chicago, and the editor sent me back a letter, a rejection letter, saying, "I like your paper." And he said, "But we don't criticize Nobel Prize winners around here." And that was the rejection explanation of why they didn't publish my paper. And so that's one question. You question the existence of antitrust regulation. You don't ask that question at Chicago. And at the time, you do not ask the question of, do we really need a central bank? You don't ask that question. Their answer was always, yes, we do, as long as it's run by smart people from the University of Chicago. That was always their answers. And I didn't think that was a very good answer. And so what I did was I did a literature survey. Any book that you would pick up from any library in the world at this time when I was doing this research and looked that had anything to say about antitrust regulation in America would tell the same story. It would say there was a rampant monopolization going on in the 1880s. Markets failed. Government came in, saved the day. In fact, in front of the Federal Trade Commission, which is the U.S. government's one of their agencies to enforce antitrust regulation, there's a giant statue of a horse and a man trying to wrestle the horse to the ground. And I have a friend who worked there for a while during the Reagan administration when they tried to dismantle antitrust regulation. And I asked him what this statue is about. And he told me that the horse is supposed to be the Federal Trade Commission and the man is an economist trying to wrestle the horse to the ground. But of course, that wasn't the true story. That was his interpretation. The statue was built long before he got there. The horse is supposed to be capitalism running wild, and the man is supposed to be the government trying to tame capitalism. That's what the symbol, and that's really the story of the origins of antitrust. But it's a phony story. It's a false story. It's a lie, I have found. And as I was saying, I looked up every book I could find. I had a research assistant. I was at George Mason University at the time. Got every book in the library about antitrust, and they all said the exact same thing. Not one of them had one piece of data to back this up. Not one number was in there about the effects of rampant monopolization. Well, the standard definition of competition by all of these same economists had to do with many firms. And what does monopoly do? They restrict output and raise prices. That's the standard neoclassical theory. None of these books had a single number on what was happening with regard to production or prices in the period leading up to the antitrust law. And I thought that was very curious. Why, where's the evidence? And sure enough, there was absolutely no evidence of this. And so I gathered the evidence myself. There are data sources in the U.S. that are readily available. You have to do a lot of digging. Historical statistics can be difficult to deal with because the methods of collecting them 100 years ago were not as good as they are now. But I did get pretty good statistics. I got what statistics do exist on such questions of, well, what was happening to industrial production in the allegedly monopolized industries this time, and what was happening to prices? Were these monopolies raising prices, like all of the books in the world saying they were, to justify the existence of antitrust? And you see, my understanding of Austrian political economy led me to ask these questions because I saw a relatively free market in America in the late 19th century. There were protectionist tariffs and there was some regulation, but it was relatively free, certainly compared to what we had by the 1930s or 1950s in America. And it just didn't make much sense that there would be all this free market monopoly running rampant in this time, when in fact there were really no significant barriers to competition. The government was not stopping competition in the steel industry to any significant extent, or the iron rail industry, all the industries that were accused of being monopolies. So I sent my research assistant to read the congressional record on microfilm back in the days before the internet to get information like this. Very few of the students here probably have any idea what microfilm is, but it's the kind of thing that could make you go blind very quickly if you had to do much reading on a screen on microfilm. And we got a list of all the debates that were taking place over the Sherman Antitrust Act, and made down a list of all the industries that were accused of being monopolies. And in short, what I found was that even the decade prior to the first federal antitrust law in America, even though the GDP was increasing, these industries that were accused of being monopolies, on average, were increasing production 7 times faster on average than the economy as a whole for the decade prior to the Sherman Act. So these were the most rapidly expanding, most dynamic industries in America that were being accused of being monopolies. And then I found price data. What was happening with prices? Well, this was a period of price deflation in America. The consumer price index actually fell by 7% during the decade prior to this American antitrust law. But when I got data on the industries that were accused of being monopolies, the prices there were falling by 53%, 22%, 12%, 20%. Every one of them was falling by several times faster than the price level had been falling. And so all of these industries that had been accused of being monopolies, I found, were the most innovative, most rapidly growing, and most voraciously price-cutting industries in the country. And I kept reading, and I found that the congressmen, the legislators who were debating this antitrust law, I wanted to know, well, what exactly were they complaining about? That they were justifying passing a law that they hoped would do something to stifle these so-called trusts. A trust was just a way of organizing the management of one of these large companies. That's why it's called antitrust and not anti-monopoly. But I found members of Congress saying things like this. There's a congressman named Mason. This was during the American Congress debates over the first antitrust law. He said, "The trusts have made products cheaper. They have reduced prices." So they were saying this, and they were saying, therefore, we need to do something about this. We need to do something about this price cutting. Another congressman said, if the price of oil, for instance, were reduced 1 cent a barrel, it would not right the wrong done to the people of this country by the trusts which have destroyed legitimate competition and driven honest men from legitimate business enterprises, end quote. And that told pretty much the whole story to me. What that told me was that there were these innovative entrepreneurs who were figuring out how to cut cost and price to the tremendous benefit of all the consumers, but their competitors, who are not as competitive as them, did not like this because they were either unable or incapable to cut their costs and prices too. Therefore, they wanted a law that would stop their competition from cutting prices. It's protectionism, in other words. The origins of antitrust in America, the roots of it, the reasons for it were protectionism. It wasn't consumer protection. It was protection of competitors from competition. So the story that I tell in my research was that there's no puzzle as to why antitrust, according to the Chicago School, has been enforced in a way that harms competition for 100 years. It was always designed to do that. There's no mystery here. And so, and I kept reading even further. I sent this research assistant of mine to read. I told him, go find out what the New York Times was saying about all of this. And the New York Times was the biggest newspaper in the United States at the time. I read all these stories, secondhand stories in books about the popular press and antitrust, but I wanted to see, what they were actually saying firsthand, from firsthand sources. And what we found was that the New York Times originally supported the antitrust law, but then after they observed what was going on in Congress for a couple of months, they totally changed their position. And another thing that helped them change their position was their knowledge that the sponsor of this law in America, the Sherman antitrust law, was a man named Senator John Sherman. And this law passed in July of 1890, and in October of the year, Senator Sherman was the sponsor of what is known as the McKinley Tariff Bill, which at the time was the biggest increase in tariff rates in American history. And so here is the man who's, some books call his law the Magna Carta of free enterprise, the Sherman antitrust law. And here he is 3 months later sponsoring a law that everybody knows would be harmful to consumers. And what the New York Times concluded is what I think is the correct interpretation of this whole story, was that the antitrust law was designed as sort of a smokescreen or a fig leaf designed to fool the public into thinking that the Republican Party that sponsored all of this was on the side of the consumer, while at the same time passing two laws that would be very harmful to consumers just because they label the one law the antitrust law, that the average citizen would think, well, the Congress is protecting us from these trusts. And what are these trusts doing? Well, they're dropping prices. And so there was no big outcry by consumers for an antitrust law. The consumers were not saying, the price of sugar is declining precipitously. Please do something about that, U.S. government. Cause the price of sugar to go back up. That never happened. But that, in essence, is what you have to believe if you believe this was a pro-consumer law. And I really do think that the reason why, and I'm the first economist to ever publish something like this, challenging the origins of antitrust. This was published in the International Review of Law and Economics some years ago. And the reason was, that I was the only economist after observing more than 100 years of antitrust regulation, was my understanding of Austrian political economy. It gets you to ask different questions, if you think that way. If I was thinking of competition in the same way the Chicago School economists think of it, and that these perfectly competitive equilibrium is my benchmark, I would not have been interested in these questions. I would have done something else. I would have been a Chicago School economist, I suppose, and not even thought of questioning the origins of antitrust. Another thing that I did, and this is somewhat related to this, is I also always thought the whole story about natural monopoly was on shaky grounds. And of course, the story of natural monopoly, at least as told to Americans, is that the same period of history, late 19th century, early 20th century, industries with heavy fixed costs like electric power production, natural gas, water supply, and later on telephone services had economies of scale. And the problem was one big company would achieve economies of scale and very low cost and prices first before anyone else did, and would monopolize the market for, say, electric power or natural gas, the public utilities, as we call them. And that would be a bad thing. It's another free market monopoly. And so therefore, the standard story is, well, there's a virtue to this because we want large-scale production and low cost, but we don't want monopoly and the high price, so we'll regulate the price. And we, the government, will not only regulate the price, but we will step in there and actually create the monopoly in the first place. We will give a monopoly franchise to one big company and prohibit competition, and then we will regulate the price in the public interest. And so whenever I hear the words the public interest, I always smell a big fat rat. And so should you. And so anytime there's any kind of economic theorizing that even mentions the words public interest or social welfare, red flags are waving everywhere as far as I'm concerned. And so even though this was a widely accepted theory, it became evident that most economists do what most economists do, and they never get up out of their swivel chairs. They sit in their faculty offices and theorize. But sometimes you just have to go to the library and read about the history of these things. But, you know, for an academic, that's a lot of work. And so therefore, most academics don't do that. It's a lot of work for that. It's much easier to sit in your office and theorize in front of a computer. But I've always been a library rat. I kind of enjoyed digging around. If any of you watch the television program CSI, I think of myself as sort of an economic CSI. I'm an investigator. I investigate these things. I'm going to have to start bringing those little flashlights to the library that they use on that television show to read some of the older books. But it turns out that this story of natural monopoly is totally false also. It never happened that way. In America, there never was this evolution of free market monopoly due to economies of scale in the called utilities industries. And other economists have looked into this. Harold Demsetz, the former UCLA, I think he's retired now, UCLA economist, Harold Demsetz, in one of his studies of this subject, he asked the same question I did. Well, what did competition look like in these utility industries in the late 19th century? Was this true? Were they evolving into monopoly? And here's one of the things he said in one of his papers. He said, 6 electric light companies were organized in 1887 in New York City. 45 electric light enterprises had the legal right to operate in Chicago in 1907. Prior to 1895, Duluth, Minnesota had 5 electric lighting companies. Pennsylvania had 4. During the latter part of the 19th century, competition was the usual situation in the gas industry, natural gas, in this country. Before 1884, 6 competing companies were operating in New York City. And he goes on and on and on, cities all over America. There was very vigorous competition. There wasn't one big monopoly taking over on the free market. But how did we get monopoly? We've had monopoly in America in the public utilities since about that time, the late 19th, early century, in telephone, electricity, natural gas, water supply. How did this all come about? Well, I found the explanation for this is that the theory of natural monopoly popularized more by one man more than anyone else, and that was Richard T. Ely, who was the co-founder of the American Economic Association and a professor at the Johns Hopkins University. He wrote a series of articles. There were newspaper articles in the Baltimore Sun newspaper that were turned into a book that made the case, told this story about natural monopoly. And it wasn't based on historical reality. It was a hypothesis or a theory about what is likely to happen. And of course, governments latched onto this as a rationale for what they did eventually, which was to grant monopoly franchises. But it wasn't based on what was actually happening. It was T. Ely's theory about what he feared would happen and his rationalization for why he thought we needed to have government regulation and government creation of monopolies. And by the way, Richard T. Ely, when he co-founded the American Economic Association, the statement of purpose of the AEA was that laissez-faire is unsound in practice and unsafe in morals. Or the other way around. I forget, it might have been unsafe in practice and unsound in morals. So it was founded on a condemnation of capitalism, the American Economic Association. That's why Ludwig von Mises never joined. He supposedly said they were a bunch of socialists, and I suppose he was right if you read the founding statement about the American Economic Association. But there is other work that you can look at into how monopoly did appear, which I have done. And there's a book that was published right in the same town where Richard T. Ely lived at the time. It was a history of the electric power industry in Baltimore, Maryland, where I work now, where my office is about a 20-minute walk from where Richard T. Ely's office was 100 years ago. And here's what happened in the state of Maryland in the U.S., and it's the exact same thing that happened in all the other states in the U.S. with the creation of monopoly franchises in the so-called utilities. And this is from a book on the history of electric power. In 1890, a bill was introduced into the Maryland legislature which called for an annual payment to the city from the Consolidated Gas Company of $10,000 a year and 3% of all dividends declared in return for the privilege of enjoying a 25-year monopoly." End quote. What was happening was there was vigorous competition and attempts to form cartels in these industries. But cartels are always unstable. They collapse. They didn't work. And so the businesses in these industries ran to the government and got the government to enforce the cartels, just like they have in industry after industry after industry in America. The utility industries were not different than other industries in America, where monopoly was created in this way. Private attempts at cartels fail. So how do you really enforce the cartel? You get the government to make it illegal to compete. And that's how you enforce the cartel. And that's what happened in America in the so-called utilities industries. It wasn't free market monopoly at all. It was all the work of politicians. And it was sort of a sweetheart deal where the politicians will say, we will give you a 25-year monopoly, and then we will share the loot with you. It's kind of like a gang of criminals creating a mafia-type enterprise to monopolize business in an entire city, and the government takes its share of the loot with this 15 dividends and a $10,000 payment. I see this as no different than if Europeans are familiar with the HBO series featuring the Soprano mafia family, the Sopranos. It's sort of like Tony Soprano putting the pinch on the local merchant to give him money in return for permission to operate. There's really no different to me than that. And there's another American economist who wrote in the 1940s, his name's Horace Gray, who saw through all of this. It's remarkable to me how many economists, of course, the Richard T. Ely's of the world provided the intellectual cover for natural monopoly. Remember the point I made earlier about how Austrians like Murray Rothbard have always understood that state intervention like this has to have a rationale, and that's the role of sort of the court historian or the court intellectual, to provide an intellectual rationale for interventionism. But this economist, Horace M. Gray, saw through all of this, and in an academic journal article, he said this: between 1907 and 1938, the policy of state-created, state-protected monopoly became firmly established in America over a significant part of the economy. And then he goes on to say that once this happened in electric power and natural gas, almost every other industry in America started saying, wait a minute, I'm a natural monopoly too, just look at me. And so they started hiring some of these same economists to make arguments that say the real estate industry was a natural monopoly, or the milk industry is a natural monopoly. And so they kind of like this idea. And I would think that that fact alone should cause anyone to think this is not good for consumers. If you have industry going to government saying, regulate me, please, that can't, it's time to hold on to your wallet whenever you see that. But he put together a list of these industries: the radio industry, real estate, milk, airlines, coal, oil, all the agricultural industries, the wheat farmers, the cattle ranchers. We're natural monopolies. Regulate us, please. Make us a monopoly. And so that's what went on. Fortunately for Americans, the government didn't have enough resources to create all of these monopolies, but they did in enough industries, however. But once again, if you think of competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process, and if you understand political economy and how politics works, as well as the Austrian view of markets, you'll ask these kinds of questions. And natural monopoly is another one of these holy grails in economics that most, I don't know what the percentage would be, but most economists think, well, of course, we needed natural monopolies. If not today, maybe technology today has made it possible. I know in America, electric power is a little more competitive because you can buy and sell electric power that's transmitted over power lines. So if you live in one state, that state can buy power from many different sources without actually generating the power. That didn't exist 50 or 75 years ago. But still, like with antitrust, you'll have very few economists ever even asking the question of whether natural monopoly regulation was necessary. And it's sort of a similar story to antitrust regulations. Chicago school economists, in particular, published hundreds, maybe thousands of journal articles about how natural monopoly regulation has created bad incentives, has done bad things, has distorted the allocation of resources, but they never question the origins of it. They always assume we needed it in the first place. And the implicit assumption is always that we'll put us Chicago school economists in charge of this and we'll be better regulators. We'll be more enlightened. It never seems to work out that way, though. My friend who told me this story about the horse in front of the Federal Trade Commission was a Chicago school economist. He spent 4 years there, and what he decided to do during his 4 years there during the Reagan administration was gather as much data as he could from the files of the Federal Trade Commission so that when he went back to academia, he could write more articles about it, about how badly it's managed. But he didn't seriously think that he could actually change things for the better because, of course, the politicians would never let him change things for the better. Because there's a reason why they have these agencies, and that is they're a form of sort of barrel politics. It's another vehicle through which politicians can dispense favors, mostly to powerful and wealthy corporations at the expense of the general public. And so they're never going to get rid of these institutions. That's a source of their power, as far as that goes. And they're never going to voluntarily get rid of these institutions anyway. A third example I'll mention in the time that I have, and I'll let Joseph let me know when my time is up. It can be the time. What's that? 10 minutes? Okay. I'll try to leave a few minutes for questions if you have. I spent 8 years at George Mason University. I went to graduate school, studied under James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, the public choice economists, and I was part of the public choice school as well as the Austrian school for many years. Still consider myself to be a part of that group. And I was a graduate student when a lot of the research on so-called rent seeking was going on at the Public Choice Center, which was in Blacksburg, Virginia at the time, at Virginia Polytechnic Institute. And I've written articles on the subject myself. And this is for the students. This is basically the main way of thinking of so-called rent-seeking is lobbying for protectionist tariffs. The resources that are used in lobbying for protectionist tariff are said to be a social cost because companies that do that could have alternatively be spending their time producing better or cheaper products. So the more time businesses spend trying to lobby government for special favors, the poorer we all become because the less time they're spending figuring out how to produce better or cheaper or newer products. That's the opportunity cost of rent seeking. That's why that's an important subject. So I had written articles on this general topic of rent seeking. I thought it's a very old idea that deserved to be revived or resuscitated by the economics profession. But then I thought it sort of went astray in my view. Articles began appearing talking about rent-seeking as a social cost to society that was not only involved in lobbying for government favors, but involved such things as advertising, product differentiation, and corporate mergers. And so there were articles began appearing in the economics journals saying, well, the costs of rent-seeking are probably much higher than we think, because look at all the advertising money that is spent. That's rent-seeking too. And I thought, there's a problem here because it's really not the same. Say you have a company like Coca-Cola. Is it really the same if Coca-Cola goes to Congress and tries to persuade Congress with bribes? We politely call them campaign contributions, about the bribes is what they are, to make Pepsi illegal or to impose some regulation that would disproportionately harm Pepsi compared to Coca-Cola somehow. Is that really the same sort of behavior as Coca-Cola taking out a new television ad on television advertising why you should go out and try to drink Coca-Cola? It's not the same thing at all. In the first case is essentially legalized robbery or legal plunder, as Friedrich Bastiat famously called it. They're trying to have a law or a regulation passed that will take money out of the pockets of their competitors and put it into their pockets. Zero-sum game. advertising is an essential part of the competitive process. They can't force you to drink Coca-Cola. They can only try to persuade you to try it out, to drink their new products. And if you like it, you'll keep coming back. And there's nothing coercive about that, as there is with legislation or regulation that is designed to just transfer money from one group of people to another. And so I published several articles on this in various journals, the International Review of Law and Economics again, in the Journal of Institutional and Theoretical Economics. I had an article in there challenging the whole idea that rent-seeking should include such things, normal practices, as advertising or product differentiation. There's a well-known industrial organization economist named Keith Cowling. He even published an article in the Economic Journal, and along with Dennis Mueller, not Keith Cowling, Keith Cowling and Dennis Mueller were the two co-authors, arguing that the U.S. Congress should set up a new congressional committee to regulate product differentiation and innovation and decide which industrial innovations should be permitted and which should not. That is, which ones will be designed to create more rent-seeking and which ones would not, which I thought was totally an upside-down way of thinking, because if Congress were to set up a agency like that, it would create rent-seeking. Companies would bribe congressmen to prohibit the innovations of their competitors, but to allow their innovations. That's exactly what would happen. And I think this wrong-headed way of thinking all comes from a wrong-headed view of competition. Again, if you view competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship that sees such things as advertising and product differentiation as essential to competition, you would never in your life entertain the idea of having Congress or the government of some agency of some sort regulate innovation. If you want to kill innovation, put the government in charge. You'll kill innovation. I guarantee that. They tried to kill innovation. In fact, as far as innovation goes, to give you an idea of what a good job the U.S. government would do in regulating innovation, as everyone here probably knows, the U.S. government harassed Microsoft Corporation for about 10 years, ultimately filing a lawsuit that went nowhere. And it was all instigated by Microsoft's competitors, mostly its American competitors, like Novell Corporation. But the judge in the case, the federal judge in the case, and the government were on the same side. The judge in the case was eventually thrown out of the case because he was so biased. The three federal judges who appointed him thought he was so biased, he was giving magazine interviews comparing Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, to Al Capone, the famous American gangster of the 1930s. And so he was a little bit biased. They kicked him out. But the case the government made against Microsoft was never a case against consumers. They never made a case that Microsoft has ever harmed consumers. But the case they made was Microsoft spends so much money on innovation, $3 billion a year, and it's so successful at it, they produce such great products that some of its competition might just give up and say, we can't compete with Microsoft. Therefore, in the future, there might be harm to consumers, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now. That was the government's case against Microsoft. And so what they wanted to do was they attempted to force Microsoft to share the source code for Windows with the whole world. It'd be like forcing Coca-Cola to share the recipe for Coca-Cola with everybody so that everybody could make Coca-Cola in their kitchen, if you will. That's what government will do if you put them in charge of regulating innovation. And yet we see economists urging this, and I think it's all because of a wrong-headed view of competition and politics for that matter. And so the students in the audience, if you want to understand how the economic world works, there's no better way of doing it, in my view, than studying Austrian economics, public choice, political economy, and study the mainstream too. You have to know what they're saying. But that's why I think institutions like this one are a real godsend to the Czech Republic, to have an institution like this one where young people have the opportunity to really educate themselves in political economy that can really help them understand the world in a way far superior to your peers who don't have an opportunity like this. And my time is about up. Thank you very much.